everyone, welcome to Square State. I'm your host, Michelle Jackson, resident Colorado expert. It's like I'm a unicorn. I actually grew up here in the Denver and Boulder metro area. Today, I am really excited to share Barry from Podcasts in Color. We're going to talk about podcasting, the things that you should do, the things you should avoid, and best practices. So hopefully we'll get more podcasts about Colorado local events, things going on, and that this advice is helpful to you. Huge thanks to our sponsor, ModWorks. ModWorks is one of my favorite co-working spaces in the city of Denver. It's located on the 16th Street Mall, basically right across from Civic Center Station. It is a beautiful location on the 13th and 14th floor of a building with a view of the mountains. If you are interested in becoming a member or taking a tour, I will make sure to share a link in the show notes. The show notes you'll find at squarestatego.com/Berry, B-E-R-R-Y. Again, you can find the show notes at squarestatego.com/Berry, B-E-R-R-Y. I also want to thank the attendees who attended my inaugural The Welcome Mat event presented by Square State. You're probably like, what the heck is The Welcome Mat? I am actually going to do another podcast episode talking about that. But without further ado, enjoy this week's episode with Barry from Podcasts in Color.
Hey everybody, this is Michelle, and I am really excited to have the following guest because we're going to geek out about all things podcasting. Had a little bit of a tech issue, like the worst one I've had in a year, ironically, with a person who's like a tech guru, podcast guru. It's a little embarrassing, but that's okay. My goal with this episode is to really help would-be podcasters think about the things that they need to do to have a kick-ass show, reach the people that they're trying to reach, and just so without further ado, and by the way, I'm really lucky because this young lady lives in Colorado, and actually we both went to the same high school at very different times because I'm older, and I am just thrilled that I can get her to have a conversation with me, and just, I'm so excited. Anyway, hi Barry.
Hi, glad to be here. And I have technical issues too, so don't even worry about it. It happens.
Okay. And so for those of you who are like, so you didn't give us more information on who this Barry is. Barry is the founder of Podcasts in Color, and I actually would like for her to kind of introduce herself and then talk about what that project is and how it got started.
Okay. Well, I am Barry, and that's short for Strawberry. A lot of people always wonder what's that about, but a high school nickname, so it's kind of cool that we went to the same high school, but just a high school nickname that came up. And then I started Podcasts in Color because I listened to podcasts, but of course we're in Denver, so it's very white. And so I learned that, I had access to things that other people really didn't because I had too much time and I was on Twitter and a lot of other things. So I thought, well, what if the things that I'm learning, I can make a space so that other people that don't have as much free time as me can still find the things that I'm finding. And that's how the directory was born. So I can say I thought small when I created it, and I thought the directory would be like 100 podcasts. And I was just letting people know they were out there. And now I've figured out that it's thousands of podcasts, and so it's growing into different.
So I'm actually kind of curious because you kind of glossed over this, but you wanted to let people know what was out there, but what about podcasting is so interesting and engaging to you? Why is this form of media, why has it captured your imagination?
I think part of it is because I went to an HBCU, I went to Hampton University, and when I came back to Denver, I could feel a part of that missing, like the conversations that I got to see and the other things, got to hear, and the other things I got to see while I was there. And so for me, podcasting has brought those types of people and the kind of people that I'm looking for back into my life, because it's not that I'm going to find a whole bunch of them in Denver, but they're everywhere, so it's just a little bit easier. And I'm not a TV person, so, like, if they had a TV show, I can't promise that I'd watch, but I can listen to the audio while walking around. So,
why do you think there's this perception that podcasting is just for, like, white bros versus, people of color or women or what have you? Like, why do you think that is, and do you feel like the rest of us have kind of caught up with this way of communicating and sharing ideas?
I think people have caught up, but they're not sure how to market yet, so not everyone is understanding how to be found. And I think it's mainly because, that people see podcasting as white, mainly because of the biggest voices, and that's because podcast companies feel comfortable with white men. And so it's nothing to say I'm going to put a white man on this show, and, people will listen, and I'll put all the marketing I can behind it, and we'll make it happen. But we're seeing the effects of that, especially with WNYC and the people and the white male hosts that they're getting rid of and that didn't come back, and the other things that are going on right now, that's not always the answer. So
wait, what's this WNYC? What happened? I'm out of the loop.
It's a podcast company in New York, and basically this past week, some of the women of color stepped out to say that they had been harassed by a certain host. And so that host isn't on the network anymore, and so his contract was renewed, but they won't say why. Wasn't renewed, but they won't say why it wasn't renewed. But then it came out, I want to say either yesterday or today, that there's some allegations against current hosts, so the shows have been suspended, and those are white men too, about the harassment of women that work for the company. So it's been I would say a big thing on my timeline this week. I want to say her name is Ferrari. I don't know if I'm saying that correct, but I think SARAI, but it's a black woman that worked at WNYC that I was aware of before, but it's a lot of people coming out, and that just happens to be the network in the spotlight at the moment.
Oh, so I'm out of the loop. And now imagine I'm drinking a cup of tea while you're saying this, by the way, like spilling the tea. So when you're listening to podcasts, I want you to kind of break down what the experience you think most listeners should have. Like, what should happen when someone lands on a podcast so that the listener experience is such that they will come back and want more from that podcaster?
I think it's the podcasters showing they're knowledgeable on whatever subject that they're talking about, and that they're having fun. Because a lot of people will start a podcast and they're so used to Twitter or Facebook or something, it's like every time they say something, they'll say the counterpoint to it and then say why that point isn't good and all this stuff, and instead of just having a conversation they want to have and not worrying about how it will be received after it's published or the different things that they're going to say. So to me, the best podcasts, even the problematic ones, are the people that stick by what they're going to say. They understand what they're saying. It's just not something they're saying off the tip of their tongue and it sounds dumb. Like I like the Bodega Boys, and they know they're problematic and they'll say different things, but they're understanding the other side of it, but they're saying it anyway. And some people will say things and you're like, I know you didn't read up on that. And so it sounds weird because you don't know enough to be talking about this. Why are you even doing it? And so people will pick pop culture or something. And it's like, should pop culture be your thing if you don't know the entire story? And I'll feel bad for, like, knowing the whole plot line of something of love and hip-hop for, like, the last 5 or 6 years. And, like, somebody will be on a podcast and they'll be talking about it, but they won't know the details of why somebody else is mad at somebody else or something else. And it's like, maybe this isn't your love, because when you love, stuff like this, you know all the little facts and things that go with it, so maybe it's not what you should be talking about. And so that's what some people don't understand. They'll make a podcast for what they think people want to listen to instead of what they actually want to talk about.
So basically you want people to be genuine about their interest and just to own what they believe. Like it's almost like the purest form of freedom of speech, because this is what ideally you love. You're bringing this to people, and this kind of second guess or double back on that becomes kind of disingenuous.
Exactly. I would say it kind of gives the example of the Daily on the New York Times, where it's like before it came, it was like a news podcast. It's going to be every day. And now it's something getting, 1 million people almost per episode or something like that. And it's like, wow, how are people living without this? And so it's like maybe something has already been done, but if you're doing it and you're passionate about it, people are going to want to listen if you're knowledgeable. So it's just saying I can create anything if people really, if I'm good at it, people will take to it.
So what is your number one pet peeve for the podcast that you listen to?
I feel like there's a lot of different things.
I remember having a conversation that first time I met you. You brought a lot of things up, and I was like, "Oh, dang! Oh, I need a checklist."
Let's see. My number one pet peeve, I would say, is not thinking about things from the listener side because of how I come into this. It is as a listener and just getting tips because of all the podcasts I listen to. So I think if somebody actually sat on the other side of the table and said, if this podcast was published and I was a listener, what information am I not seeing or what information should be giving that I'd be like, I can't find that. So some people would do something and it's like, but you can't find the host anywhere. The host knows they're the host. But on none of the, social media or anything like that, I can't find out who that is. And if I can't find out who that is, how does that help me, figure out who you are or other things about you? So I think a lot of people don't think about the listener. They're like, okay, I recorded, I got enough information out, and now the episode is out, and I'm done with it at that point. And to me, that's where I'm like, no, that's the starting point. Now you need to think about what's happening after, how am I engaging, and, other things after the episode. So to me, it's like that after publishing thing.
Let's talk about the after. So I've released a podcast episode. You're new to me. You've stumbled on. You've shared some kind of keyword search, and you found my episode. What, as a listener, should happen? What should I make happen for the listener?
I would say that if your episode notes are good, you're good. Because if your episode notes are good, that means your social media, if you're on there, is in the episode notes. Your website, if you have one, is in the episode notes, and it's clickable to the person. And it's just making sure that person has access to you to say, okay, you know what, in the episode notes, it tells me this is every 2 weeks, so I'll look for this episode again in 2 weeks. It's leaving the new listener with enough information to say, oh, you know what, let me go follow them on Twitter, and I have them. Oh, okay. They put out episodes early on Anchor, and then a week later they show up on Apple Podcasts. Let me go figure out what Anchor is. Just giving enough information so that the person can make a decision to go from there. They don't find the podcast and say, okay, I hope it posts weekly, and I guess I'll just wait it out. I don't know. So giving information.
So what is Anchor, by the way?
Anchor is it's a podcasting app that you can podcast from your phone, and I think you can upload from the web also. So basically, they don't pull their RSS feeds from Apple Podcasts. They let people post on their own. So they're their own app, and so they're kind of separate from what other people do. But you can do a podcast on there and download the podcast and put it anywhere you like. But if you do publish on Anchor, it doesn't go all the way out to other forums as if you were on Lisbon or something like that.
Okay, so you got me thinking here. Now, I'm wondering actually about marketing, because I think that might be where most people struggle, and consistency. So if you could talk a little bit about how you find podcasts, what podcasts do to kind of hook you in, and what you would advise people to think about as they're marketing their show, and then talk about consistency and what you as a listener are looking for in terms of a well-thought-out, well-crafted show.
Let's see here. I would say as far as finding a show, now for me, people will let me know about shows, but I still search I Google different things, just search terms that I think about just to see if anything new is popping up. Or even on Twitter, I'll search different things, or looking under the Pods and Color hashtag, I'll see podcasts that hadn't submitted or to the website, and I'll let them know that the website does exist and, learn more about the podcast. I would say one of the best things someone can do as far as marketing is make sure you have something showing how to listen. Like some people will do a great logo, or they'll do these cards where it's a huge logo and things like that. And it's like, why don't you do the logo in the corner and put how to listen on Apple Podcasts in the middle and how to listen on Lisbon or an Android type of app below that. So it's like if you can give the steps on people saying this is how you get the app on your phone, this is what you search in the app, and this is how you subscribe, that gives people better language than just saying this podcast exists. Because one of the biggest issues with sharing podcasts is giving a new listener the language to say, what is a podcast? How do I get a friend to listen? You know, what are the steps if I have an iPhone and my friend has an Android phone, and all the other little things where you're like, I'd rather just not talk about what I do when I'm not with this friend, but to give them a thing to say, okay, I listened to this podcast. It's called The Read. And the steps to listen are on their page. I'll send you that, but it's really funny. It's easy to get to, you know, to have some language. I know a lot of people that listen to podcasts and do not talk about them with anyone because they don't want to have to go through the steps of helping them figure out how to get the podcast. With consistency, some people feel like, okay, I have to be out there every week once I publish. And to me, it's about creating seasons. So you can say, you know what, I'm going to publish podcasts for 2 months, and then I'm going to take 3 weeks off, and then I'm going to publish podcasts for 2 months, and I'm going to let the people know this is my publishing schedule, and giving yourself breaks. Because no matter what, any podcaster that's trying to put something out every week the entire year is going to end up with, you know, how we started this call, there'll be a problem or an issue. Yeah. They might not be able to, you know, record, and then they're late, and then they're frustrated that they're late, and then there's just all these other things going on. But if you've already said, I'm publishing 6 episodes, that means you can plan out those 6 episodes. You might even be able to record them earlier, and you're not necessarily as worried about as that weekly content, especially if you're not being paid to podcast yet. So to me, if you're not being paid to podcast, you should have a schedule. It should be kind of short, giving yourself time and space, because it's not about doing a weekly podcast to get you paid. It's about saying you're setting up a good product, and no matter if you're only there 3 or 4 times a year, if you have it where people are looking for you, you have a good product, and that's what you should worry about putting out, not just putting out anything every week.
The wheels are turning now. I'm like, what would a good product be in terms of a show? And I feel like we kind of talked about this before, but maybe dive a little deeper into that. Like, what would a sponsor be looking for in a show that they might sponsor? This is also being researched, especially with podcasting and how new it is. I can't even remember the number that was last year, but they were saying the number would probably double to quadruple in ad money for this year. So, like, the money is only increasing, and as there's more ad people get into the business. And even with what networks are given, we don't have the data from Apple Podcasts. So most people are making up numbers or, you know, using their influence, like we'll run the ad and we'll see what happens on the backside, which is why on a lot of podcasts you'll see go to the website / the podcast name, and that's how they'll notice that, you know, enough people went to the link and people are responding. It's not just giving out something and saying, you know, go get the discount. It's like, let me lead you back to say the Read sent you or this podcast sent you. And what sponsors are looking for, to me right now, is creativity, because that's how bigger networks and mid-roll and other people get podcasts, where they say, I'm going to tell you why this podcast is good, and then buy ads on it, and we can figure out if the people that listen to my podcast like your ad, and maybe we'll change it and things like that. But some people think they need to have 20 or 30,000 listens to get money. And to me, it's like if you were having 200 people listen and they were local people and you were actually getting them to maybe use your hashtag, you can say, after every episode, I have at least 20 or 30 people using the hashtag during the week, and I know if those are the people that are active, you know, there's other people that are in the background that might not be as active, so why don't we play around with seeing how active they'll be to go to this restaurant in Denver or something like that. So it's like you don't need thousands of people, but if you can help a happy hour get 15 to 20 more people in a city, that could be what they're looking for, and that could be, you know, an exchange of that money in some type of way. There's a lot of different things. Some people think it's just Blue Apron, and I'm like, maybe there's a real estate agent in your area, and they could help, you know, people anywhere with talking about real estate, and you can make sure they're able to sell in the city. But they could say, I could be a consultant if somebody has questions on real estate, or, you know, what if it's a cleaner somewhere and they have locations in different states. I think it's thinking out of the box of where we already are and selling people what a podcast ad could be for any podcast. And so that's what I've been thinking about right now. What would be a well-crafted, what do you consider a well-crafted episode?
A well-crafted episode, to me, there's a point at the end. So whether it's 30 minutes or 2 hours, it's when you finish, you feel like I learned something or I had fun, and not like what just happened for 2 hours. Like, should I have left after an hour? Did they talk about anything? Were they just laughing at each other, and I don't really know what was happening half the time. And so to me, it's like some people will have these things where they'll have a conversation. I'm like, but what is the end point of the conversation if you want to know if the friend zone is good? Like, what are people supposed to learn from you all talking about this subject? So I like podcasts that are story-based. Those are good to me. Like there's The Nod, and that's a new podcast on Gimlet. And they will do a story or talk about other things, but at the end, you have a point and you've learned something. And they've explained their views on it, and you've heard other people's views on it. And at the end, you're like, okay, they didn't force anything on me, and I know more about the subject. So it feels good, and I'll tell somebody else they can learn something from this podcast. So just putting something out there that when somebody finishes, or even when you finish your own, you're like, ooh, I took something away from that. And that's what a good podcast is. No matter if you have segments or don't have segments or just talk to your friends, it's just at the end that you're giving the feeling that something good happened.
How many podcasts do you think you listen to a week? Like, how many episodes are you consuming?
I counted 1 week, and it was over 30 episodes. So I do know I'm not average in what most people are
an outlier.
But that's really because I know of so many podcasts, and how my day is set up with podcasting is that it's going to start probably with a podcast and end later on with one. And I'll listen to, like, sometimes the podcast will be 2 hours, and I'll do a half an hour of the podcast and then another podcast with maybe 45 minutes, then back to a half an hour of that podcast. So I don't always just sit through each podcast all the way through. It kind of matters how my brain is working that day. So, but I love finding older podcasts that have a lot of episodes, and it almost feels like I don't have to think like an old TV show that you've watched anyway. Like, you can just sit on reruns and, like, binge through it, and it's like I already kind of know what's going to happen, so it's comfortable, and I'm not trying to guess what they're doing. So I feel like with the access to podcasts, I can usually always find a podcast that has 3 or 4 episodes that I haven't listened to, and that's what I can do for the day. So,
what's your goal with, like, you're listening to all this content, you've met, I would say probably, or connected with thousands of people through this project. What is your goal? Why do this? What's the end result of doing all this?
I've been thinking about that. That's changed over time. It's really something I'm in the process of rethinking and rewriting down an end goal, because when I started Podcast in Color, my favorite phrase was, I don't have a podcast. And I will have a podcast in a couple of weeks. And so I've just been trying to say, what do I want to do with Podcast in Color? Because when I started it, it was more, I'm on Twitter a lot, I'm talking about podcasts, my timeline doesn't care. So I started my own Twitter account, and I may as well have a directory to go with it, and other people can help, find other podcasts that I'm talking about. And from there, it's kind of grown out of things I didn't even think about. Like, right now, I have a job in the podcast industry. Other people have talked to me about other types of jobs maybe I can do. And so it's like, what do I do with all this information I learned? Do I want to be a podcast consultant? Do I just want to do social media for a bigger company? Do I just want to work on a podcast team and I help with the marketing part? And I don't know, there's so many options to me now of what I'm doing. So I'm really thinking that in 2018, I want to make sure my webpage on Podcast in Color is updated every week, because I've been doing it monthly as I've gotten busy. And I want to make sure I'm highlighting podcasts that are creative with what they're doing. It's not just pop culture. Maybe you're doing a local podcast. Maybe you just talk to your friends about their lives and days during the week. I want to make sure different podcasts about different things are being highlighted. It's not just the same ones I only know about.
What has been the feedback from different people that you've connected with about this project? Like, just different podcasters and how you've shared what they're doing. What's the feedback?
I would say it's love. I haven't received anybody that, like, hated me yet, but I'm sure that's just because I haven't had a podcast yet, so most people don't know my snarkiness to the point that it can be. But most people are excited that I exist. They're happy that they can, easily tell people about other podcasts, or they can find podcasts that fit them. And I hear so many different things people think I could be doing. And I think that's harder when I meet people and they're like, well, you could be doing this, or you could become a resource for this, or blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, there's like 20 million things that could happen, and I'm one person. So
wow.
one of the hardest things it's been is that I want to add people to the Podcast in Color team, but what do I want them to do? And I don't want to tell somebody they can be an intern for free. I don't believe in that whole working for free. As poor as I've been, if somebody's going to work with me or anything, I want them to be able to be paid in some type of capacity. There's just so many options. That's what I feel like. My world is way bigger than what I would have thought this would have been 2 or 3 years ago, and now I have to kind of horn that in and say, this is what needs to be done, and this is what I want to do.
Do you think it's still a good time to get into podcasting? And do you have any thoughts on the net neutrality situation that we're about to get hit with?
Oh, yeah, I think it's a great time to enter podcasting because the industry is growing and more ad money is coming and more people are learning about podcasts. So right now, most people depend on people that already listen to podcasts, but if you think about all the people that don't listen to podcasts that you might be able to convince to listen to your podcast, there's endless options. And the whole net neutrality, I can't say that word correctly, it's frustrating that we're even having the conversation, and it almost feels like the tax bill or other things right now where it's like we've been yelling. There's no amount of quietness that has ever been about these subjects. And the people that want them to be different have their own goals. So it's hard for me to even talk about, and it's something I feel really passionate about. And I told people the other day, I said, it feels like every week or even every day there's something where you should be calling your senator to tell them how you feel and filling up their email. And it's like, we do all that. They know how we feel. This is not something that people are quiet about. So the fact that if you do this, you're doing it for the purpose of taking things away from other people, which to me means it could happen because that's what they want to do with healthcare and all the other things that they're doing. So it's hard for me to talk about because I feel like some things, no matter how much we fight, are going to be done because the people that want them to be done are going to do them anyway. It's like you can go and make sure they don't leave their house and the highway is stopped and people can't get to work. People are doing the work. People are protesting. This is not people. Sometimes new people to the arena act like there's no one else shouting and voicing their concerns. And I'm like, there's whole websites. There's whole people that's all they dedicate their timelines to all day. There's whole senators that are out there that are like, please call my coworkers so this doesn't happen. And it's like, why can't you talk to your coworker? And why is it that thousands of people have to be angry about this, and you still are going to try to do it in 1 or 2 in the morning where it's not that much of a fight and most people are asleep or something? So it's like, it's frustrating to me, mostly.
Don't hold back. What's the number one activity, process, or habit that you think podcasters should be in the habit of doing that you don't think they are?
Transcribing. And there's free services out there if you Google free transcription services, but transcribing to be found, because we all know, just like with blogs and websites, that you'll Google a phrase and then a blog post will pop up and you're like, this is exactly what I was looking for. And so basically with podcasts, if you've transcribed and people are searching for different things, you will pop up in the same way if you have that available. So to me, it just makes it easier to be searched, especially by keywords. And then you'll get into a blog talk of SEO and other things like that, and affiliate links that you can put in, to your notes or when people find you selling different things. So to me, transcribing is the biggest thing that big podcasters are doing, or people that are wanting to make more money off something simple that's already out there.
If you have an hour-long conversation, you're like, do transcribe that conversation. I guess many people might wonder, are there people reading that, or is it just it's a marketing hack, if you will?
I read them, and I know other people that ask for it, so I'm guessing that they read them too. And to me, sometimes you have to take the sign of, if the New York Times is taking the time to make sure their podcasts are transcribed, that means that they're running into enough people that might be deaf or other things that want to know about the content that they're saying it needs to be provided out there. So I figure if a big service is making sure they put the time and pay someone to do it, they're not doing it because they have the extra money, because in media right now, that's not something people really have. But they're saying this is worth it to us if we do this and put the time and money into it.
That is, okay, that's food for thought. And then, curious, does POC for you encompass just African Americans, or is it all brown people, or like who really are you targeting with Podcast in Color?
It could almost say, like, not white. Like, if you don't identify with white, you could be a part of this website. So I don't give passes, like, to picnics or anything like some people might do. But for me in Podcast in Color, I specifically did not call it Black Podcast or anything that have to do with only African Americans, because I like hearing from voices that are Asian, and I part Native American, so I like hearing from, other people that look like the other half of my family and things like that. So there's voices out there, and I feel like they should be heard. Like, one of my favorite podcasts has a host of I believe, Asian person and a white person, and that's called By the Book. And I only like it because they kind of are different. And one of the hosts, Jolenta, she's so funny. Well, her and her husband are, like, just naturally funny with the way they deal with each other. So I like being able to do podcasts that are going to just have voices that are going to give a difference to, I guess, the white voice.
And I think because I do have a lot of white people who listen to this show, I think there needs to be clarification, which is this project isn't by no means saying I don't listen to white people's podcasts. I would think that would not be the case because you listen to so many podcasts. I'm assuming it's just an answer to an issue, which was, hey, these people have a platform and we don't, and I think that I'm going to just start one.
I would say that's it. Like, I listen to podcasts that are all white. Like, one of my favorite podcasts is called Please Advise. It's located in California with a white host. And it's not necessarily like, I'm just saying there's other options, as you said. There's other options. There's other voices. And most people get in, and what you see on the curation pages and the different things are mainly white voices. And so my thing is, there needs to be a place, at least until those people catch up, on having where you can find people of color. And even as those people catch up, I think maybe I'll change into something else. Like, if I don't have to be the only one highlighting these podcasts, there's other things I can do with the information.
I'm thinking. I'll obviously edit that I'm thinking out because that's how it goes sometimes. How does a show, so you're listening to a show, what will compel you to subscribe? I mean, you're listening to a lot of content, so I'm assuming that you are not subscribing to all of them. So what's the make or break for that decision?
A make or break for the decision, it feels like the podcast is together and they aren't depending on me to come back next week. Like, they're going to, make the podcast whether I come back next week or whether somebody else, does or doesn't. They won't be back next week like, nobody listened. They'll be back next week like, oh, I have something else cool to talk about, and this really means a lot to me, and that's what brings me in. Like, there's a podcast called Dear Queer, and I'm not a queer person, but it is a hilarious podcast. And the different people she picks to talk to and the conversation she chooses to have, I'm like, thank you for this. I don't know if I'll ever see you in a top 200. I hope I do one day. But the content you're making is for you and the people that you feel like are around you, and that's what I like.
Wrapping this up, what advice would you give to someone who's interested in starting a podcast, but they're nervous about the quality of their sound or what they have to say or just the process of doing it? I'm in different podcasting groups, and I like the groups that I'm in, but I do think that there is how do I put this, a snobbery almost about like the equipment that people use, things like that. It's almost as if they forgot what it was like in the beginning. And so what would you like to say for that would-be podcaster about the beginning?
If your audio is bad but your content is good, people will come back and hope the audio gets better. They'll probably write you about it like, oh, hey, I don't know if you know that I can hear this in the background or something like that. But you don't have to let the audio stop you. Like, even if you're podcasting from your phone, there's different things you can do to make the audio better. And some people think it's going to be the mic, and I'm like, there's a couple of mic conversations that I have that I don't even have them anymore because people will be like, I love this podcast. I mean, this mic. And then somebody else will be like, that mic is trash. And it just, and so there's going to be arguments about everything. But if you're actually trying and you're good at what you're doing, people will encourage you, and you can always Google different things, or if you're in podcasting forums, ask for different ways to help with sound. But to me, sound isn't something that should hold anyone back. And as far as a podcaster, a new podcaster, I would say talk about what the podcast is going to be about on your social media or to your friends. And if you can interest them in just talking about it, the idea, they'll listen to the podcast. Like, I tell people I'm going to start a podcast on podcasts because my Twitter account tells me when I talk about podcasts and I'm sharing different things, they like that. So if I was going to start another podcast, it's something I would talk about on Twitter and see if people respond, see if people take to it. But if I'm talking about it and never getting a reaction, I'm not sure it's something that the people think I should create, or something that people think I'm knowledgeable on that they even want to hear about. So to me, it's like, if you want to start a podcast and you're like, maybe I'll do it in 6 months, it doesn't hurt to start having conversations about the subject matter of the podcast on your Facebook timeline or on your Twitter timeline to see the kind of things people really do want to hear about it. Like, if I'm going to do a Grey's Anatomy podcast, I might start live tweeting Grey's Anatomy episodes and then getting people like, oh, you're funny when you're talking about the show. And it's like, yeah, in a couple of months I'm going to have a show talking about this, so hopefully you'll listen in. So just thinking, what can I do to prep people to get them excited about what I'm doing? And that's not just saying, I'm going to start a podcast, I hope you listen, but saying, I'm going to start a podcast on X subject, and I'm kind of lead you into it before I start the podcast.
Ooh, and that's a really, really good piece of advice. And I'm wondering, because I know you've done such a good job of this, how do you go about growing community via social media?
That can be a hard one, because a follow does not equal a listen. That is just something that's complicated to me. And to me, growing a social media following is what I tell podcasters do, is tweet about somebody else's podcast. And especially if they have other listeners and things, if you find people that like to listen, you'll find out what their annoyances are. Like, if you're talking to somebody about a podcast you like, they'll be like, oh, I like that podcast, but I don't like that segment they do. And you're like, oh, okay, why didn't you like the segment? And it just gives you other feedback. It might not be feedback on your podcast yet, but it's things that you can apply to your podcast. Like, people do not like when you go over an hour, or people do not like when you eat on the podcast, or little tips that you can put in that you're like, I can do this and make sure I've already got this covered, so if stuff pops up, it's not things I could have already known by talking to other podcast listeners.
If people want to get in touch with you and just follow what you're up to, how can they find you?
You can find me. There's I'm going to say an information box. I can't think of what it is. A Podcast in Color, but you can contact me there. Contact box, there you go. Contact me there. My email is podcast@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter. I do answer DMs on Twitter. And I'm on Instagram and Facebook, but I don't answer DMs there as much because it just, when you can see the red receipts of it, it puts pressure on me, and it's hard for me to respond. I'm about
to take a social media break for the next month. So yeah, I like social media, but I'm finding that all the stuff with the news and all the crazy is just too much for me right now. I need a break, and so I've put some boundaries up for a while. So that's all I got to say on that.
Okay, so just in you saying that, that's one thing that's happening right now, is that engagement on Facebook and Twitter and other things are down. Like, some things that would have been like huge, a year or two ago, don't get as many responses. And so, I don't know, it's just something I've been looking at. I'm like, even people that have huge accounts, I would say 100 to 200,000 followers, they'll ask a question and not always get a response. And I would say a year or two, it would have been like 30 or 40, it'd be so many responses that they knew. And somebody could sign on now, and that doesn't always happen. So the way people are reacting to be online, and like the way they engage and who they are engaging with and why is changing. And I don't know all the answers, but I can say that is changing. So it's kind of weird.
They're driving me crazy. But I do notice that I'm interested in video. And so I think I'll leave you with this question. What is the role of video in podcasting? Which sounds like a weird question because podcasting is audio. But are you seeing people embrace video of some sort within their show notes on their websites, things like that, or going to YouTube? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm against, okay, so a podcast is recorded audio that people put out. So people will have a YouTube show and call it a podcast, and I'm like, but if you look at the definition, it doesn't necessarily fit what's going on there. So it's a downloadable thing. So I do like video attached to it. Like a lot of people have YouTube followings, and they'll put up, even just the audio with a background on YouTube, and sometimes they'll put up little videos of them in the studio or things like that. I think video can be incorporated because people want to see what podcasters look like, kind of what you do in your process, other things to feel even more connected to you. But sometimes there's YouTube shows and there's podcasts for me. So I'm not a fan of the YouTube podcast thing, but you have 85 South Show, and they're huge with one guy now on MTV, and they're always touring and selling out things. So there's people that are doing different things with the forum, and I can't hate on that because they're making it work. So if you can make it work and that's where your people are on YouTube, and you publish it as a podcast also so that other people, can be a part of it, that's fine because, a hustle is a hustle.
And actually, this will be the last question. For the people that you see who are really succeeding at this, and I'm not necessarily talking about people with massive downloads, but maybe people who've been able to really kind of focus, get stuff out there, and get people onto their email list, just create really happy listeners. What are the things that you're seeing them doing that you think other people should consider?
I would say they're putting in the time. They're not waiting for people to come to them. They're not, sitting back and looking at download numbers and that things. They're saying, I'm going to create an email list, even if I'm only getting 100 people a week, because as I grow, it's already there. It's people saying, I'm going to do this anyway. I'm not waiting to a certain point or to hear a certain thing to do this or grow or try different things. They're saying, I'm going to do it anyway, and hopefully, as I grow, this can grow too, or I'll try different things, or this might not work, and I might have to shut it down after a while. Like Myleek with the My Tachi podcast. She created a Facebook group, and it only lasted like a month. And so it's just like, and I did it. I liked it. I didn't like it. I stopped it. So, it's out there. You can just try different things.
All right, people, you heard it. Barry gave us lots of actionable advice. I have a lot of, I just sat there a couple times during the course of this interview just thinking, so I was a little stumped, maybe I should be doing that. So thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your wisdom. I'm so excited for you as things move forward. I don't even think, I know that you're a force in this industry, and that people really, really need to be watching what you're up to and what you're doing and how you help the podcasting community as you move forward. I'm really lucky to get you on the show because I have the feeling that your time is going to get even more limited as your reach grows. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much, Barry, for joining us. Hopefully I will see you again at another, because sometimes we go to a podcast meetup, but I've been AWOL or something for the last 6 months. SOL. But thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I really enjoyed the fact that you said, don't let audio keep you from doing what you're doing, what you would like to do. You'll eventually over time hopefully learn how to improve that. So
thank you for letting me join, inviting me to your podcast.
And by the way, is it weird when people realize you live in Denver, like other people of color, when they discover that you're doing this really cool thing, and then they're like, where are you from?
It is, and that just brings more to the conversation of how I created what I created, because I'm sure someone in New York that have more access to podcasts and stuff probably thought about it, but then they were like, it's easy. But in Denver, I'm like, no, it's not. So it's a middle America frame of mind.
So people, if you have an idea, implement the idea. Just because you think someone else has done it, one, doesn't mean that you shouldn't, but two, you'd be surprised as to where some of these amazing, innovative things are coming out of.